Good morning, welcome to the Contemporary Issues class. What a nice turnout today. Nice to see everybody. We're going to talk today about a little book that I came across called Relationship Principles of Jesus. You know, it's funny how many books, of course, are written about what we think Jesus meant about business principles or relationship principles. There's just a never-ending supply of these books, and some of them are good, and some of them are kind of an exaggeration of what we think he would have been like as a CEO or something like that. But I enjoy reviewing these, and so we'll go over some of this today. And I want you all to share about your relationship experiences too. Mark was talking about it in his sermon today, healthy relationships and toxic relationships. And so it's a good chance to kind of share some experiences here. So Zoomers, I want to welcome you too. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Steve.
And is it Susan we have here, new person?
No, Susan will not be with us this morning.
Got a couple other folks. We want to welcome our Zoomers and any new folks we have in class. Anybody new today? First time to our class? Okay. Great. Well, our usual announcements. Zoomers, please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen so we can keep down the background noise. And we are recording this for future playback. But I do want to mention today too that we do record this and put it on YouTube for folks to watch later. But since we're talking about relationships today, be careful what you say about the relationships you want to talk about. And maybe talk about a relationship, but don't say exactly who it is. And if you do go too far, you can tell me afterwards, and I won't put this on the internet. So we can do it that way. But let's have a good discussion today about this topic. And other announcements, we have a class party September 1st. Here on Thursday, September 1st. Anything we should say extra, Alice, about that?
Did you bring the sheet?
I didn't bring the sign-up sheet today, sorry.
Okay, well, then we'll bring it next week.
Right.
We need to know how many are coming and kind of what you're gonna bring.
Sure.
So, or email
And
Steve and let us know.
I'll email. Share screen here. Our folks, so they can see on the internet too. Okay, so just for probably 10 or 15 minutes, actually, I'm going to go over some of the highlights from this book. And actually this one too, that I'm sure a lot of folks will recognize, The 5 Love Languages. Big bestseller in Christian circles that still reverberates and people live by. A lot of good things to think about there too. So let me go over just a few of these relationship principles that it has here.
Hey, Steve,
Chapters.
Tom Holiday is a cousin of mine.
A cousin of yours.
Yeah, the last name is spelled the same way as my maiden name.
Oh, very good. And he is a teaching pastor at Saddleback Church in Lake Forest, California. Lake
Just
Forest,
something
California.
nobody
That's the
needed to
big
know,
church,
but-
Saddleback Church, Rick Warren Church in California. So this is one of the pastors there. That's great, Alice. I didn't know that. You stay in touch with him?
No.
Okay. Distant relative, okay. Well, this book starts out saying, what's the most important commandment? And it is, of course, Jesus says to love God and love your neighbor, talking about the vertical relationship with God and the horizontal relationship with people. Often that's the way that it's shown symbolically. This author says, God made you to relate to him and to others. To miss out on relationships, you're missing out on the core reason that you were made. It says Jesus showed us how deeply he values relationships when he was asked what's the most important commandment. And said to love God and to love your neighbor. He pointed out those two. But a good part of this book is talking about also why we let things get in the way of relationships. Small things that and big things that get in the way and disrail our relationships, like hobbies, tasks, and entertainment. We often put those things as higher importance than relationships. Lesser things can replace relationships very quickly. The problem is that we have valuing relationships is not knowing what we are supposed to do in a day-to-day basis to maintain relationships. For example, what's the first thing you think about in the morning? Is it about relationships, or is it about the task that you have to do during the day? And how do you balance those two things? What's your schedule tell you about relationships and priorities? Schedule time for people and relationships. Look at your checkbook. What does that say, of course, about relationships too? Is your money going toward people or a lot of things that are not necessary? What do you find yourself talking about most? Of course, there's a difference between men and women. The book talks about too. Of course, women talk about relationships much more often than men do. In fact, next week, Ron is going to present a presentation here on
and major differences between the sexes.
the brain differences between
Yeah.
men and women. Yeah, physiologically and how that plays out in relationships and behavior also. So the Good Samaritan story, of course, God says that lesser values are often placed on things, relationships, that we should be focusing more on. The example of the Good Samaritan being one about who is your neighbor, of course, and how's your relationship to your neighbor. Jesus gave that example of the Pharisees that were going by and did not stop and help the Samaritan versus the one that did stop. That's the one that's the neighbor. It's tempting to think that Jesus treated relationships quickly, but really he also took time in relationships. It's tempting to think that, of course, Jesus had time for people, that things were not as fast-paced in his culture as it is today. The temptation is to make the task we are doing today more important than the people for whom we are doing the task. Ever notice that in every example in the Bible, there was someone who wanted to hurry Jesus on to the next important item in his schedule, and he resisted that. He took time to value the people that he came across in everyday life. Examples were when he came across the woman at the well. He took time to talk to her when his disciples were trying to hurry him off to the next place. In Mark 5, it talks about he went to see a sick girl, Jairus' daughter, who was near death. Jesus stopped to give a shy woman the opportunity to voice her faith to him. And the Bible's just replete with examples of taking time for relationships today. And let me stop there for just a minute and throw out that thing. What do you think about that, the issue of time today? How does that impact our relationships? Do we take the time to stop, talk to people throughout our day? It's good.
One of the nice things about growing up in the Midwest is people.
Can't hear you.
Said one of the nice things about growing up in the Midwest is people will stop, talk to you on the street as long as you want to talk. Generally speaking, it's not true in all circumstances, but they'll start with "Hi, how are you?" and then they'll talk about the weather, and then they will take the time to talk to you as long as you want to talk.
No, and when we first moved here, 40 years ago, I found most people were not very friendly. It was really, really hard just my neighborhood, or it wasn't until our kids got involved in school and I met parents and we found church. And I remember spending a lot of time crying because I couldn't find anybody to talk to. It was really hard moving here. We had come from Tennessee where everybody talks to you all the time about everything. So, from then it was Tennessee.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
The southern hospitality.
hospitality, yeah.
Mm.
I don't know if it's still that way with newcomers, but I always remember that. And I try to form a bond with somebody. That won't work, but I can try.
Well, as we all heard this morning, that little famous sentence from Mark about how many words women speak. And well,
Yes.
that reminded me immediately when Jim always says to me before we go somewhere, now remember, we're not going to stay for 15, 20 minutes after this is over so you can talk to people. And I think that's important, and I think that's what women do.
Well,
And
wherever
if
we
that's a
go,
good
we're the
relationship.
last ones to leave.
Well, that's establishing some good relationships with people. I think that's important. Of course, he doesn't even like to talk on the phone, so. I
Well, one
understand
reason
that.
now is because I can't hear. But one thing I think is fascinating about animals, us and the other animals, is that some people, you feel, talking to them a little bit like, and you can get a feeling of knowing this person a long time, or I could know this person and become friends. And other people, you don't have that feeling at all. You see that in all the animals. Something fascinating about life.
What goes into the connection, right? Okay, chapter 7 talks about how not to limit love. The author says, how can we really decide what the limits are in a relationship that we have? How did Jesus do that? I recognize, and Jesus recognized, that we cannot meet everyone's needs in each relationship we have. If I love them, they can't meet their needs, won't I also feel frustrated? Wouldn't it be easier to decide how to best manage our relationships and reduce them to just maybe a few close relationships of family, friends? How did Jesus love? He didn't spend all day making to-do lists of which people he wanted to have relationships with and try to follow up with those. He didn't have a prioritization grid that told what he wanted to do in each situation. He simply loved people as the opportunity arose on the normal traffic patterns of his life. If he was in Jerusalem, he loved the people on the streets of Jerusalem. If he was traveling, he befriended people that he met along the way. He was with his disciples, he showed love for them. The author says, my wife is better at meeting neighbors and establishing relationships in our community than I am. It's quite embarrassing for me to know how much better she is. When she finds out one of our neighbors is in the hospital or has a need, she immediately goes to visit them. Sometimes I assume that someone else will take care of that. She drops what she's doing and goes to the neighbor next door and helps them immediately. It's a good example of what we should do in establishing relationships and the obligations we have. Does that sound familiar to any of us with neighbors too today?
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Sure.
Steve,
Yes, Carrie.
I think when we're thinking about those kinds of things in relationships, it's important to understand our basic personality traits. I am an introvert by nature. My husband is not. And so he's the one that makes those initial connections and meets he doesn't ever meet a stranger. No one's a stranger to him once they've crossed his path. And so, but that's harder for me. So when I count 5 really close relationships. On one hand, I feel really good about that. He wants 50. So it's just the way that we're made, right? So I think that's a factor when it comes into, I guess what I'm saying is don't feel badly if you're not the one that does all the, if you still have relationships that are important to you, that you nurture, that's okay too. You don't have to be everybody's best friend.
I think another issue is, I don't know if anyone has seen Millennials in the Workplace by Simon Sinek. He talks about one of the issues today with millennials and those who are younger is that instead of going, when they have a problem, instead of going to another person, they're going to a device. So they're not getting the validation or the love that they need because this isn't going to do it. And so he talks about how in this 15-minute video, he talks about how people are, young people, because they're going to a device, they're at a higher risk for suicide, attempted suicide, because they haven't built the relationships with people. They're doing everything on, it's like next door. Every day, somebody is telling their life story about.
No love in that place.
Right.
Yeah.
I would counter that with, we lived for 50-some years in the Chicago area and moved out here 11 years ago. Thank goodness for phones, email, Facebook. It has enabled us to stay in touch with not only that group,
Oh,
but
me
other.
too.
I mean, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
We have 2 grandchildren who are in college in the Midwest. Thank goodness we can text.
Oh, I like it. I talk to
I
people.
mean,
Yeah, I talk
so
to
there's
people.
pros and cons.
I'm talking to people around the world. But-
Yeah.
But when I've got a problem, I'm not talking to somebody in the Philippines. I'm talking to somebody in
Okay.
the church or somebody in my school. But I agree with you. That's the only way I can keep in touch
It's a
with
gift.
the kids I used to sponsor, and now they're adults. It's the only way I can keep in touch.
Yeah.
It is. It's a two-sided.
And if you are shy or whatever, maybe that mechanical thing assists you in getting outside of yourself. And somebody out there will pick up clues of suicide or whatever and save
You
your
really
life.
have to watch the video to understand the context of what I'm saying.
Okay.
Millennials in the workplace.
What's it different for millennials today or kids to establish friendships? Do they do it the same way that we did? Except for texting more, of course, than we did, but do they go through the same process in establishing friends and having a number of friends like we did?
No.
What's strikingly different is you'll see 3, 4, 5 kids walking down, not talking to each other. Maybe they are online, but you just wonder if it is a different experience than direct contact instead of going through them.
Sometimes that allows people to say things that they probably wouldn't say if they weren't
Yes.
there with you. And that's not good, because you don't think about your words as much when you're texting something. There's a great difference between texting something because the person receiving it doesn't know the emotion that you have when you're sending it. And what you're saying, they interpreted something as horrible and it really was meant to be something very good. Those are some things that I think it's very hard to establish a relationship by those kinds of activities.
One of our granddaughters said she broke up with her boyfriend over text.
Wow.
And
Oh,
so
wow.
I thought, wow, that's different from years past. Of course, they probably did it by phone also. So another one, yes, yes.
I was gonna say, I have several grandchildren, ages 12 to 23. And I think my grandchildren that get involved in something, whether it's youth group or sports or drama or music, some sort of an activity outside of school or maybe within the school, they tend to have better relationships than my grandchildren who are more reserved and more quiet and they don't put themselves out there. And it's more difficult for them than it is for the ones that are involved in those activities. I think those activities, the kids that did, like we did when we were kids, that's how we met our friends, you know, youth group, church, whatever.
Another part of the book talks about emotions, the way that our emotions are vital to relationships. And it says that the author says that there is a picture of Jesus in Christian circles, that he was above emotions, that he was a prophet and a very spiritual person who was not in touch with his emotions. But if you read the Gospels closely, of course, Jesus wept. He was overwhelmed by his feeling of pain when he went to Lazarus and other parts of the Bible. He could have been thinking about when he went and raised Lazarus, thinking about the loss that had been so agonizing for Mary and Martha for a few days, or it could have been honestly expressing his emotions about death of anyone in general at that time. Whatever the reason, Jesus did not act as though he was above it all, disconnected from his emotions. He honestly wept. He took his emotions seriously. Jesus is often pictured as a transcendental Eastern mystic. And because of this deeper understanding, he's wrongly thought to have been often emotionally distant from this world. But Jesus, when we lived on a higher plane, was not free from the encumbrances of emotion. Consider the way that he's still pictured in movies today, wandering through the countryside in a kind of a daze. When you look at his life, you see a man filled with emotion, expressing his compassion for a man ravaged by leprosy, or weeping in distress as he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane about his death. We should also feel the emotion as Jesus did and use that in our relationships. He also quotes a classic article by a writer called the name of the article is The Emotions of Jesus. This writer says, I was honestly spellbound by the intensity of emotion that Jesus expresses in the Gospels. It was not a twinge of pity, but an honest, heartbroken compassion for people that he would come across. We are not merely spellbound by what we see in the emotional Jesus. We are also to be imitators of his spirit and use that in the relationships that we have.
He also showed anger, not
Yes.
just compassion, but when he went into the temple and turned over the tables, or was a little distressed with what was going on there.
And when he turned water into wine at the wedding, it was so that the people who were the host wouldn't be embarrassed. And he recognized that that potential for embarrassment and wanted to save them from that.
This author also mentions this book. What are the 5 love languages? Who remembers reading this book years ago? It's probably a 20-year-old book that a lot of us have done. It says that people express and receive love in 5 different ways, called love languages. It's dependent on each person, what is more important and connects with your personality. Or maybe it's all of these together. But it's quality time, words of affirmation, gifts, acts of service, and physical touch. The sooner you discover your language and that of your loved one, the sooner you can take your relationship to new heights. Bit from that book. Let's talk about that for a minute. Do you think that still holds true? That wisdom was an important part of relationships?
2 popular songs, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Let's Get Physical by Olivia Newton-John. They didn't do a hit song, I Want to Text You Now.
I remember hearing sermons about the 5 love languages for a long time now. And pastors say, we should really be doing each of these. It shouldn't just be Ask your partner which one's most important. We should be doing every one of these. Planning time, affirming, supporting, saying good things, giving physical gifts, flowers, serving, and physical touch.
Now, I'm sitting here thinking, all the movies that we love always have these. Like, Wizard of Oz, just take, you know, her relationships with people and things she wanted to do. How many? I can just think of so many movies, all the ones that we remember.
Try to incorporate all those.
Yeah.
Next chapter is about fellowship. It says how important the concept of fellowship is in relationships, congregating with other people. It says that fellowship is defined in the dictionary as companionship of individuals in a congenial atmosphere. Companionship fellowship means you must actually spend time with other people. Congenial means you actually enjoy spending time with other people. It's easy to say you love if you're spending most of your time alone and don't have to deal with the frustrations that come from actual people. You can only truly love when you spend time with others. Let's admit it, there are many barriers to having good relationships, but you can overcome these if you work at it. That was an important aspect too.
One more thing, Steve. Ron, his
Sure.
brother is Asperger's, and I don't think the man ever has a decent thing to say about anybody. He lives alone and he's very strange. When our kids were small, I did not want him around my children. And how many people are out there that are just borderline mental? And I really feel for this man. Honestly, I have a real difficult time dealing. I'll probably say the same thing, his brother.
We all probably have people we have to manage the relationship with.
We'll mention next week the autism spectrum correlation with the unique love.
And I want to ask you, when I'm about done reviewing the chapters here, but I want to throw out too, what are some of your best and worst relationships that you've had? And what defined that? Why was it so? Healthy or toxic relationships? What's the difference between an old and a new relationship with friends, for example, too? Are you making new friends, creating new relationships? And what's different today? We talked about that already. What's different today than long ago with creating relationships, types of communication, how that works into it. So, okay, last couple of chapters here. Communication is so important as a part of relationships. There is no arena of life that is immune from the dangers of words that go wrong. I sometimes hear people excuse their ugly words in areas such as theology or politics, especially. The assumption is that those on different sides of an issue can say whatever they want today to gain an advantage with no qualms about igniting a battle or offending other people. It seems to be more acceptable today to either lie, exaggerate, or say your own opinion without considering the impact on other people.
You gotta tell it like it is.
Tell it like it is, regardless of the impact on other people. The author says, I'm reminded of the famous division and then reconciliation that occurred between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Two men had become friends in the forging of the American independence. Their sharply different views and their words to each other turned them into political enemies and personal enemies. It wasn't until later in life that a mutual friend encouraged them to restore their relationship, which they did through writing letters. And then, as it turned out, the two friends died on the same day in their separate homes on July 4th, 1826. Within hours of each other. I remember that story. But a good example of reconciliation. So, okay.
I think a tragedy in a relationship is siblings. It's kind of natural to be competition between brothers and sisters. The closest relatives you have in life are your brothers and sisters, right? One thing about, we talk a lot about emotions. But I was told once by a very wise person, and to be a minister, that whenever you have a conflict between your emotions and logic, follow your logic. Because
Follow your logic.
Follow your logic, because emotions will let you down.
Mr. Spock of Star Trek would. No doubt. Okay. I gave you a little handout here that talked about evaluate these relationships and questions for each of these relationships. And I wanted to share this with you. This was from this book and others. It breaks down the different people that we have relationships with: spouses, children, grandchildren, siblings, extended families, neighbors, former neighbors who have moved away. Often we lose connection with people who move away from our neighborhood. Co-workers, friends, past friends and co-workers who we've left but often try to stay in touch with. Enemies, we have a relationship with enemies. Church staff and church members, what's our relationship here in the class or with our pastors? With ourselves, even our pets. I thought that was a funny addition. We do have a relationship with our pets, don't we? Are we really close to some or not so much others? I'm sure we can add more people onto this too. Have you ever thought of doing a review of your relationships in this way, listing this kind of category of people and going through and thinking about this? Or is this not a good way to do it? What do you think, Gene? You have been in this business for quite a while, as a gerontologist too.
It's an intriguing topic, as we all know. I was just ruminating a little bit on an experience we had yesterday, Mary, in reference to this. Yes, there are cultural differences, personality differences. We kind of glorify the Midwestern cultural ethos.
Yep.
But the accountability of knowing people in your community, big problem out west is the being transplants, not having those familiar interactions. The high rates of suicide in Western communities, I know when I was in the mental health field, high rates of suicide, particularly with our younger people, are in communities in the West where there's this feeling of uprootedness and so forth. But one of the barriers, I think today too, are some of the restrictions on social interaction. What I'm thinking about, we are honoring educators today. There was a time where teachers could hug their students, clergy could hug their parishioners. Now people are somewhat suspect. I think there's also a feeling of apprehension about people who are too friendly. And I'm getting back to yesterday's experience. We were at the Western Welcome Week, and the beer meister over there for Toma, we had a conversation. Just down the block, Steve, where it was the STEM school here in Highlands Ranch. Remember the STEM school? And there was this freshman young lady, and they had robots, and they were testing these out. I was extremely curious about the teamwork and what the kids were doing with these robots. So I began to talk to this young lady, and I kept asking all the questions. It was a good thing I had Mary with me, because an older man talking with a freshman in high school, you know, people begin to say, there's something wrong with this guy. Why is he so in? So I think there are some barriers and restrictions, unfortunately, due to transgressions that people have made interpersonal. And we certainly know about this in the church, the school, you name it. So there's a hesitation if you're too friendly. So knowing what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, I think there are more strictures on conversation. Factoring in, of course, culture, background, personality differences. Don't you think? This guy just seems too friendly, or she seems to be a little bit too nosy, or when they're actually.
Well, I was reading
The
that
etiquette,
too.
It's boundaries really, Gene, is what you're talking about. It's boundaries. It's knowing what those boundaries are. And if you don't know what those boundaries are, you're gonna find yourself in trouble easily. And if I started chatting with the stranger at Sertoma about something, he's going to think that I'm trying to sell him a pair of shoes or new grass or new car. Or
Tell me what
something.
Sertoma is again.
Service to mankind. So we've got about 15 charities that we give financial support and labor to. Our biggest focus is on hard of hearing and children that decode their.
Well, an example too in politics is Joe Biden, that he's got in trouble in the
Right.
past
Good
of
point.
hugging too much, coming up behind ladies and putting his hands on their shoulders. And they're saying that's sexual harassment in today's culture. Where she says, I'm just not used to having to not touch people. That's just who he is.
Smell their hair.
And smell their hair sometimes too.
Well, what did Trump say publicly, 4 years ago?
Right. Here is a short list of questions about relationships too that I found especially interesting and that we are supposed to try to apply to each of our categories of relationships. So ask these questions about your spouse, or your children, or your grandchildren, or siblings. Ask, why do I have this relationship? Do I enjoy it? Do we share interests? Do I feel obligated? What type of relationship is it? We're equals, or a mentor-mentee, a boss or employee? Defines the type. Who's dominant in this relationship? Is there one that talks most, decides issues, or if you get together where you're going to go eat, for example, and makes the plans? Am I getting what I want from this? What do I want from this relationship? What am I giving to the other person? You ever talk to the person about the relationship itself? What importance is it to you? Is this highest, medium, or low importance? Related to importance, what's the feeling distance of this relationship? Do I feel close to Ron, my buddy here, and fellow presenter? I do feel closer to Ron than I do to some of you others here because I don't know you as well. What's the frequency of communication? Is it daily, monthly? Who initiates that? Usually it's one person, we say, right? What's the method? Do you text them, do you call them, or do you always try to meet in person? How does that impact the relationship? What's the focus when you do communicate? Is it two-way, or is it one person talking about themselves and always just trying to get their words out? And finally, what are the boundaries? Some people, you don't tell certain information because you can't be confidential with them. Some people even do a pros list and a cons list, list the pros and the cons of the relationship. Then finally, how can I improve this relationship? Like use the 5 love languages. And should I change this relationship? Should I back off, discuss it with the person, or should I just end it? And then there are some, of course, cute internet memes about relationships these days too. This one reminded me of people that seem to fake interest when you're talking to them. You can kind of tell
Yeah.
sometimes that they're not really listening.
A very important person on this list is at the bottom.
Okay,
Yourself.
yourself.
Yes, it's very important how you think of yourself. A lot of people are kind of self-destructive. They don't like themselves. Important to examine yourself.
It's your relationship with yourself.
You know, what are my relationships? What kind of person am I?
This one with Drew Carey says, welcome to a relationship where everything is fine and you can do whatever you want. Or something like that, where people always want to be positive and make no demands on you. And so you've got a new relationship. Tell me about your future kids. Well, I wanted to ask you that question too. How about new relationships? How often do you establish a new relationship, friend, with somebody that you maybe met at church, or do we just stick with our old friends? Not really have any new friends. I have a couple of new friends from class here. They're not here today, but folks who have just recently come to church, and we've had lunch together, and I haven't done that in a while, but it's nice to connect with people and feel like you're making new relationships, not just maintaining the same ones. Yeah.
Norm and I lived at Windcrest. There are almost 2,000 people there. And when I go to get the mail or I go down to take out lunch or something, I have an opportunity to bump into somebody. We're standing in line next to each other. And it's like, okay, I've had 2 or 3 minutes of relationship with them. I may never see them again for 6 months or whatever. And what we've started to do is find opportunities in those chance relationships to say to that couple or to whatever, would you like to meet next week for dinner? And we're building a very small number, but we were there 10 years before we figured this out. I mean, it was just, you meet them and you never see them again. Meet them, never see them again.
Yeah.
And now we're getting some solid relationship with people. Those old friends from the neighborhood 40 years ago, when we were in the Chicago area, you know, they could tell us anything, we could tell them anything. We don't have that with these strange people that were.
Pretty strange.
Right.
Yeah.
I think one of the hardest things is when you retire and most of your relationships were at work. But you're also single, and it's like, now what? You know, I've got these relationships online or friend, you know, adults who I used to sponsor from the Philippines, for example. One of them is 31 years old. I still communicate with them.
Yeah,
Finding a place to connect.
even at work,
This has been the place.
you're
to be.
often focused on the job. And
Yeah.
Norma would ask me a question about somebody that I've worked with for 20 years, and I couldn't answer it because we're always focused on the task.
And I could find out stuff in the line at the grocery store.
This is especially an issue for men. The Gallup survey indicates that when you ask women who their closest friend is, they'll mention another lady perhaps. But you ask the man that question, it's my wife. So the paucity or the scarcity friendship, because it doesn't relate to work. Most of your relation, men, for guys in particular, not so much anymore today, maybe, but
Yeah.
certainly for older men.
Well, since you're talking about polls,
Yeah.
there was a poll years ago that said, what was the most traumatic event in a woman's life? And they said, when the last one leaves home, last child leaves the house. But for a man, it was when they retire, when they leave that job behind. That was the most traumatic event in a man's life.
Well, and you have to be intentional. When we left Chicago, I vowed I was not gonna lose my friends. So our son is in Michigan, so we go back several times a year and I line up,
Stops in Chicago.
yeah. to see people so we can stay in touch. But you have to, it doesn't happen by magic. You have to plan it.
I reconnected with 8 different people. Some of them were new relationships when I went to the Philippines, Vietnam, and South Korea. You know, these were people, 2 of them were former students. And they said, "You were our teacher, we're gonna buy you dinner." You know, this was in South Korea. Not once, but 3 times they bought me dinner.
And I think you need to realize that people come into your life for a certain reason and a certain time.
Yes.
And they go out and you think, what? But they're not, needed or whatever after that time.
I'm gonna put in a plug for our party here.
Okay,
And,
yeah.
if you wanna form relationships, it's easiest if you sit down and talk to people, and maybe it's somebody you're not familiar with, although you see their face all the time.
Right.
You know, like I know more about Wanda because we sat and had a conversation for half an hour at the women's retreat than I ever knew about her before. So, now I consider her a good friend. And I can say that about a lot of people in here, but I don't know everybody. So, come.
I want to mention 2 things. One is Zoomers, please feel free to jump in here. You won't be interrupting. We'd love to hear your comments.
Thanks, Steve. I just thought of something. One way to connect with old friends is by Zoom. I have a group of friends from my junior high, middle school. It wasn't called middle school back then. Junior high, high school days. And we get together on Zoom every 3 months or so. And it's a wonderful way to stay connected to old friends.
Yes, that's good, Ann. The other thing I was going to mention was Facebook. Of course, it's got good and bad aspects to it, as we know, but it has undoubtedly connected a lot of people from their earlier life that never would have found a way to do it without Facebook. An example for me is I just had lunch last week with a guy from college that I hadn't seen in 40 years, and we connected on Facebook. He called me and said, we were good friends in college, but hadn't seen you since, and I'm coming through Denver, let's have lunch. And it was wonderful. So,
do you recognize each other?
Yes. Yeah, but we look a little different. That's right. But another good example. Anybody else done that on Facebook? Or just connected with friends from high school? You too, Joyce?
Yeah, I have a cousin. I went to the center this summer, and we connected on Facebook because I saw that her husband had passed away. So I went to Cape Cod for a week. She's coming here in the spring. I would never even know.
I chat with a friend I went to kindergarten with, and we've been friends for 75 years. She lives in Ohio and we live out here, and but you gotta do it. You can't wait for the other person necessarily.
You started I think the very first question you ask is, how does our busy life and time interfere with, and so on. And there's a woman that she was the predecessor to my job that I have, and she did some training with me. And every year she comes back to help with a particular big, gigantic project at the end of the year. And we've always enjoyed each other's company. And this last May, she said, this is really my last year. I'm going to be able to come back and do this. And we both realized at that point, oh, I'm so sad. I want to see you again next year. Well, why are we waiting to May? Why are we not friends? Why? What? And we've met every week since for coffee or whatever. And it's just taking the time to be intentional, like you just said. You have to make it happen if it's important to you. And I consider her a good friend, and how silly of us.
That's true.
Yes.
That's true.
Yeah.
There's an art to relationships. If you're intentional, there's a lot of decisions that can go into it too. How many close friends do I want? Do I have time for? How many distant friends that I communicate once in a while?
She's on a reunion. She's got like 12 girlfriends.
My
Every
wife-
year she gets together with them since kindergarten, I think she said a couple of
Yes,
them.
my wife is gone today because she is meeting with 12 high school girlfriends who are in the same class. They've kept in touch since high school, get together every August, and they have a wonderful time. How unusual for 12 girls from the same class to stay in touch over the years like that. I think.
From a mental health perspective, going back to that one, Steve, it's better to have one confidant. It gets into the question of how do you define a friend? What is a friend? As opposed to having, I have many friends, but to have one confidant in relationship to mental health stability, that is the key. To have at least one person, rather than say, I have lots of friends, but I'm not close to anyone in particular. So there's some nuances. What is a friend?
I was
What
gonna
takes place in a
tie
friendship?
the same comment
Yeah.
back to, we often are not aware of the barriers between ourselves and others and our own weaknesses. And it takes a confidant who will come in and tell you the truth. It's necessary for you to realize you're close to suicide, or it's necessary that you realize how you're hurting your kid. Somebody like that, you can hear it. But if it's a stranger telling you, you might not listen.
Don was a psychologist in Chicago Public Schools for many years, so he should know about relationships.
And it was protective of me as well. I had relationships with kids, and I was this white guy from the poorest school district in Northeast Ohio that grew up and had a steep learning curve in Chicago, how to survive. But there were days when kids would come to me and say, Mr. Dutter, don't go home on Adams Street today. There's a gang fight planned. And they saved my life. So it was both ways.
Yeah, there's that question of who do you call at 2 a.m?
Yeah.
And there was a poll recently about how many people would say that they know someone that they could call at 2 a.m. and that call be received warmly if you're in a crisis. And that's really an interesting question.
Yeah.
Right?
If you get 3 calls tonight.
I keep the phone by my bed. Yeah.
That's another good point to curious. What's the expectation in a relationship? You're my close friend, Ron. What do I expect of you? Are you supposed to support me in everything I do, or
Tell you the truth.
two-way communication?
Tell you the truth.
Tell you the truth. Okay.
Really
Whether
take you
it's
to the airport.
kind or not.
Right, right.
Really take you to the airport.
And several noted, there are some friendships that are just, I play pickleball with them. That's that relationship. I don't really see them outside of that, but I really appreciate them for that relationship. There are some people that I call at 2 a.m. There are some people that I knew when I worked 3 jobs ago and we've kept in touch with. So it's that kind of thing too. And
Situational.
yeah, kind of situational, and I consider them friends. But they may not cross over to that other category either.
Close
Yeah,
friends.
right.
I think I'm in a group where there's, no matter what you do, what you say, who you are, there's no criticism from others. We just all laugh and talk and share and you can say anything.
I want to be in that group.
Yeah.
Well, they're all in Oak Park, Illinois, which is why I go back there.
Let me give a plug also for men's covenant groups here at St. Andrew. There's women's groups that are called something else. We have W circles,
Sisters.
I think, and sisters group. Yeah. Ron and Steve and I are in a covenant group that meets every 2 weeks. And Bob too. I'm sorry, Bob, I didn't see there for a second. Yeah. You're a close friend, Bob. But
Steve, just before we
has helped
end,
to establish.
the last point triggers something in my head. If you're in a toxic relationship, and as a Christian, there's sort of a built-in, I've got to stay in this and gut it out, and work. And maybe somebody who really knows you well can say, you're hurting yourself, it's no good, get out of that.
I call that the missionary impulse.
Okay,
We want to bring them in or get them to church.
and the best thing for you would be to walk away, get away from that. for
That's
your
why
own health.
AA groups are so successful. So many, particularly men, so.
I have a confession to make.
Sure.
One of the saddest things I've experienced is learning of someone's death. That I should have kept in touch with.
Should have kept in touch with it.
And, I'm gonna make a telephone call tomorrow. My friend Jerry that I grew up with, lived next door, and I don't want to get a telephone call finding out that he died. And
Good point. Mention people while you can.
I can't, that's right.
Right, before they are gone. Absolutely. We've got just a couple minutes left. Final thoughts about relationships. A lot of good stories today.
Say kumbaya.
Kumbaya. Let me ask about grandkids or nephews, nieces kind of thing. I would think sometimes, I had aunts and uncles, but never had any relationship with any of them. And it would have been, see them at Easter and Christmas, maybe at a grandparent's house. Or my grandparents, I never had really much of a relationship with them either. How do we go about those? Value those much? Extended family? Should you take time? Does kids care? Is that just kind of a second class thing? What do you think?
And that's a real challenge with blended families today too. His and hers, don't you think? I mean, it makes it more complicated, even more complex.
I just think sometimes it would have been probably good for me as a kid to hear from an aunt or uncle, what is your plan? What are you doing in life? Just to establish a little bit of a relationship would have been a good example. Tom, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking about having a healthy relationship with yourself so that in those very limited or chance encounters at the grocery store line or whatever, you're not thinking about yourself. You're actually fully present, listening. And that's a gift a lot of grandkids don't get.
Yes.
Somebody who will listen.
And you have to be vulnerable in a friendship, don't you? A lot of people don't wish to be vulnerable. I might get hurt, get too close. Lots of folks.
Does anybody take their grandkids out for lunch? Just the two of you, for example?
Take them to Europe, take them.
Take them to Europe too?
Yeah, we have.
Wonderful.
I was born to be a Nana, so I am Nana to my granddaughter's college soccer team, which I just love.
It's such a high compliment. She'll get whatever it is on video with our granddaughter and all the other soccer girls that they will in chorus say, "Hi, Nana."
Oh, cute.
So that warms her heart.
It really is. It's about me as it turns out, not about them.
It isn't easy sometimes to keep in touch with grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But I feel, well, I'm going to, whether they respond or not, that's their problem, I guess, or however they feel about it. But they know that there's someone, at least this great-grandma or this grandma, who wants to just keep in touch, find out how they are. That's important.
All you can do is try.
Right, and, you know, sometimes I feel, well, they just don't want to talk to me too much, they've got other things going, and I realize that. But I think it's good for them to know that I want to keep in touch, in case they want to.
Kids are so busy.
Yes, it may be just one, well, I don't think they're that busy.
Oh.
But I think, you know, that it's, well, she's always there. you know. And
They
so,
think they've got their whole lives.
yes.
Well, that gets back to the issue of making time, taking time. Taking time.
We don't have grandchildren, but we have adult children that are still fairly young, because Paul and I had children at a later date. They're only 32 and one just had a birthday, 35. And I'm old school and I don't text, and our daughters really respect that. And I leave it up to them to call them on their time. But it's amazing how much we do communicate by phone. We also do Zoom visits. They were just here for a Colorado visit. They also contact their dad if they're all at the Alzheimer's community that Paul lives at, usually at least once a week, and I really feel fortunate that we've had that kind of relationship. And people are surprised that we talk on the phone as much as we do.
Good for you, Ann. Thanks for sharing. Well, we're out of time. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your thoughts, and I hope you've had some things to think about here with this. We'll see you next week. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.